My name is Bob Baxter from the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to come back to Russia. I was here in the summer on another project, which again I will talk about tomorrow at the round table. But much of my career has been involved, I tell you this but not by way of apology, but I am a plant ecologist by training. I'm not an Earth observation deriver, if you like, in a sense of all these wonderful things that we've already seen this morning. But I'm very interested in spatial scale. I study process with organisms, and much of that work has been done, as Gareth has already beautifully illustrated, in terms of the tundra taiga, the tundra forest zone. And I've spent the last 25, 30 years doing that in Europe and in Canada and North America. Not yet in Russia, but I have high hopes. So my interest is very much to do with scaling. I haven't chosen the easiest research career in many ways, because I'm dealing with upscaling things. I'm interested in biological processes, in the soils, in the plants, in the atmosphere, and how they scale across very heterogeneous, very patchy landscapes. And I should maybe in life have chosen something easier, but it has been a great challenge. So a friend and colleague of mine, Professor Paul Stoy from Montana State, so here is some fields, but rather than the Arctic or the northern Eurasia, but he shows this nice diagram, and I think it's nearly correct. As a biologist, I am interested from the genome all the way to the globe. I have big ambitions, I suppose. I want to know what's happening with organisms. I want to know with components of, often, as Gareth has already said, often very biodiverse environments that change on the scale of centimeters to meters, but yet which we need to quantify to get to those regional and global figures that we are trying to get, as Sergei has beautifully pointed out earlier this morning as well. And Earth observation clearly is the only sane way of being able to provide and constrain those estimates. But using also, as Gareth has said, field observations, ground truthing, if you like, at spatial scales that are relevant and through time, so that we actually have a constraint on helping those values that we and our paymasters, our governments, wishes to find out, of course. Very much linked to Paris and how we predict the future. And I say much of my past rather has been in trying to see what the future of these Arctic and northern systems are like. And so here we see climate overlain on this system here and the interactions between individuals. Climate really, this gentleman is a geographer, not a biologist, so he's constrained climate just to the individual. Of course, it's across all aspects of the organism from genome all the way through. But you can see here nicely, this part here, where they've put that ecology sits in this sort of region. Well, I would, yes, but I do have interest down here. I am brave sometimes, and I have interests here. But this is where really I sit. So I work with people who are experts in Earth observation closely to try to help downscale products, because we sit in this process of in the middle. I am trying to build things upwards. Other people are trying to downscale, of course, as well, and we try to see if we can meet in the middle. And it's exciting and it's fun, but it's difficult, as I'm sure many of you in this room already know. The circumpolar Arctic regions, as Gareth has already said, very important. They're an important home to many people of varying nations, not least Russia, and the massive amount of land surface that surrounds the Arctic in this great country. So there are real life impacts in these regions, as well as just the biology of all those things that Gareth has already mentioned. So the work that we're trying to do, many of us in this room, has real value, I would submit. Very quickly to add to Gareth's I didn't talk with Gareth before this at all. He said so many wonderful things that really helped me in this talk. But One of the things here is from the Arctic Climate Impacts Assessment way back now in 2004, sorry. But why do these northern regions warm more, as Sergei has already said? Why do they warm more? Well, partly because actually snow-covered landscapes and changing of snow and the albedo, the reflectivity that Gareth has said, partly due to more of the energy coming in from the sun in a shallower atmosphere makes a big difference in terms of the heating, the forcing, the climate forcing so-called. Sea icing is retreating and again changing the reflectivity, changing the absorbance of the darker oceans compared to the white ice. And we can also see that there are alterations in atmosphere and oceans that are happening in these northern regions now as people are trying to exploit them for shipping as things open up. So it's a really important part of the world for the planet. The sorts of simple questions, yet difficult answers that I seek are the following. How much carbon is stored in the Arctic? Great question. Difficult to give you a number, but it's important to know. Gareth made the very important point that yes, we have forests which have more biomass, fixing more carbon, storing more water, and yes, we have less vegetation at the present time, at any time we look, on the landscape in the tundra. But underlaying that tundra, of course, are something like 14% or more of the Earth's carbon. So although they're slow growing, cold and wet conditions, as a biologist, we produce lots of organic soils, of peatlands. So although we might not have much vegetation, we have a big store over millennia in terms of the carbon that's there, which may get back to the atmosphere should we warm. So that's a very important point that's driven much of the work that I've done. The vegetation might not look so interesting, but actually it's been doing what it's been doing for thousands of years and doing it extremely well. So how long does that carbon stay in the soils? Do they deal with it differently? And are the sort of field measurements that we can measure consistent with sorts of regional data that we may get as estimates from, for example, Earth observation? And to do that, I've used, and my colleagues have used, a range of these multi-scale studies, all the way from looking at things within very small area to some things which, of course, come from spaceborne observation. Critical problems I've already mentioned. Heterogeneity. These beautiful landscapes that many of us know in the forest and in the tundra are beautiful because they are heterogeneous. Plants change, and you can stand from one and move to another, and you have changed the community almost completely. But yet they scale to have an impact in terms of gas exchange, climate forcing, of course, at the landscape, the region, and of course, eventually through teleconnections to the globe. So they're very important. As a biologist, pretty much like as Gareth has said, really, there's lots of process uncertainty still, even in the biology of the organisms that we're studying. So we don't even have that real baseline. We're still finding that information out. Some of the solutions then. Models and data fusion. I'll come to that at the end again. But more importantly, multi-scale observations. And this has driven a lot of the advances in recent decades, and certainly in the recent few years. Very quickly, Gareth has said that there is this possibility that as we warm, the so-called tree line, this transition zone, as he says, may well start to move north and will change quite a large area, particularly Russia being a perfect example of that, as you can see the large changes there. And these changes in reflectivity, these changes in absorbance, in warming, may have very large effects, as Sergei has also said. And just to sum that up, we don't like tree lines. They're not a line we can go and draw on the map. They are transition zones, but they change in these ways. It's not a uniform change. Not everything will move north. If things melt, things might move south if the permafrost melts on permanently frozen land. So there's lots of things happening on different spatial scales. Gareth has shown a very nice picture of birch, and so will I. I have worked mostly in northern Sweden, Norway, Finland, my backyard, and there we have these open, sparse canopies. So that the tree line, if we use that general term, is formed not of coniferous forest, but of this deciduous forest, this open, sparse, deciduous forest underlain by the other vegetation. And Gareth showed beautifully there that from space, one small shrub may look very similar in terms of the signal you get from the larger system here. So these are interesting places. And they're very interesting in terms of the composition of that transition zone. That's again why I studied them. Okay, don't panic. Surface energy fluxes, all sorts of issues of hydrology and carbon cycle are very much dependent. We can describe them through process, but they're there in terms of latent heat, heat that's doing the work, and radiant heat that we can feel are all changing in these different canopies and forests, and they're all transmitting potentially to the ground, heat flux of heat to the ground, the movement of heat to the ground, movement of water upwards in transpiration and evaporation. They play a major role, and we need to know something about these things as biologists. But how can we do that at a spatial scale that's relevant for future predictions? This is one of the land areas, those people who've ever been to Abisko in northern Sweden, research station, very famous in Sweden, a part of Interact and the many different establishments, including in Russia, around the circumpolar Arctic. And just standing on top of a mountain, doing my remote sensing with a camera, very cheaply, as a British person, you can see that there are very patchy landscapes of forest interspersed with wetlands, with dry areas, with the lichens that Gareth has already shown. If we look at the same sort of thing in winter, the snow shows that as well with us, that we have water bodies covered, different reflectivities. We can see where the forests are. So here we can see the water bodies. Here we can see some of the wetlands that haven't quite frozen out here from heat capacity earlier in the year. Other areas of forest, other areas of patchy with tundra in this transition zone of neither really forest nor yet tundra, in this interesting zone of competition that might change. Okay. As a British person, again, I like to do things cheaply. So we have used some sort of, I would say, remote sensing on a very fine scale, looking at temporal heterogeneity as well as spatial. Gareth and Sergey have already mentioned the importance of repeat measurements of imagery through time that we can use to build up a picture over years or through days or weeks or whatever. I'm going to show you now a short animation. I was very ignorant when I first went to these parts of the world. I thought that, like many parts of the world, snow would come, snow would stay, and snow would leave. Sadly, no. This is the day of the year in the Julian calendar, late in the year, of one of these cameras looking across the landscape, taking a picture every day, mostly if it didn't break. Snow comes, snow goes. Day by day, there are changes in the microenvironment here. You can see these trees at the very edge of their distribution, and you can see some days they lean with the big wind. You will see this. But the key thing here, which I want to show, is the transition shortly, as we're in the next year, into spring. As many of you have been, if you've been to that part of the world, to the north of this country or elsewhere, spring is often not a slow process. Spring is concentrated. So in a minute, snow will come and go, and there will be some last minute, yeah, back. And then, quickly, the images come, this will become green. And it's fast, here we go. So it's just day, boom. And so having this type of information sliced, even at this very fine scale, and then you'll see towards the end, suddenly short summer, and very quickly again, the transition from there, into autumn, and so it goes. So these are really important fine-scale information that I need to try to do something with on a bigger scale, of course, to make predictions. So I was involved with the Abacus Consortium some years ago from the United Kingdom Natural Environment Research Council, and it was part of the international polar year events that some people in this room may well have been involved with. A large number of us got together of different backgrounds to try to tackle these problems. We worked in two places, in Kavo, beautiful research station in northern Finland, and in Abisko in northern Sweden. One of the products I'm going to talk about today was this paper that we looked at. So we're interested in carbon and carbon uptake and carbon release. Whether we are going to have a sink for carbon dioxide taken up by the plants on the landscape, or whether we're going to have a source, a transition to a source potentially in the future if we warm this system. So carbon dioxide is important, but perhaps more important in some ways is methane. Shorter lived in the atmosphere, but about 23 times thereabouts more radiatively active in the atmosphere whilst it's there. Greater climate forcing potential. And methane is produced by methanogens, by organisms that produce methane as part of their biological life cycle in anaerobic conditions, just as cattle produce methane when they ferment in their stomachs. Similarly, the process where you have lack of oxygen in systems in wetland areas often. What are often called hotspots of activity. But there are other organisms you will see later which take up methane from the landscape. And so the value we measure, if we measure it as scientists, is a net effect, is a composite of those two processes. And it's very important. You'll see that they'll see later, they differ in magnitude greatly, but they differ also greatly in the area of landscape over which they operate. So, on these landscapes, we wanted a multi-scale approach. So, we had plots at the landscape scale for the ecologists like me. There we are making measurements of gas exchange. Also in smaller systems across transects of these things. But then, also by a process I haven't got a lot of time to talk about. Many things that we do, we put a chamber on top and we measure the gas. But that affects relative humidity, it affects vapor pressure, it affects all sorts of activities. But there is a method by which we can do this without a chamber, by measuring 10,000 times a second a concentration of gas in the atmosphere, and through some scary physics, we can work out eddies as wind moves across the landscape. We can say whether gas is going to the vegetation or coming back in a very broad scale at the time I have. So we can measure without a chamber, and we can measure integrated over an area. But that area, as you can see on this stylized diagram, is heterogeneous. Different components are doing different things under the same conditions. There is the system that we use. So here is this tower on which we measure up here. And the height of this depends what is called the fetch, the area that is being measured over this, integrated over this surface. And there's another one. And then we measured NDVI, we measured these actual leaf area index, but now using not in the atmosphere, but also we used from the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom a slow-flying plane. And we can measure gas in the atmosphere all the way to the boundary layer in the atmosphere of the world, of the globe, or the planet. But it can also fly very low and slow, and can measure in the atmosphere across the bigger landscape. So we have this potential to scale. And you'll see in a minute we use more Earth observation than that from satellite. Here we go. So we were trying to combine this whole process of scaling that both Sergei and Gareth has already mentioned. So here's an image of the area that we're interested in. This is Landsat ETM+, way back in '92, this one, but it just shows the area. And we were working basically, well, we can show now here, actually, if you look. So the red part here is birch forest, and then we have these areas here of certain areas here with lichen, but also in this system we have lots of wetlands. So you'll see a picture just here. And so these are, again, a zone of where we have these birch trees, but also we have these big wetland areas. And up to 30% of the area, I think, in this part of Finland, in this case, can be of wetland areas. So they're very important. But in these wetland areas is where probably, with the right organisms, we're producing methane. But in these areas above the water table, in the areas above the water table, we are have more mesic conditions, less water, not too much, not too little. And different organisms live in those soils. And they're the ones that take up methane as part of their metabolism. Just shown here, in fact. It's a very similar sort of system. Here's our forest, here's our water. And we have either producing methane, in this case, or we have systems where methane is being taken up. And so what we measure in the atmosphere is a balance of these very important biological processes. And so what we wanted to do was to measure this. So we had, with colleagues from Exeter University, we measured on floating chambers, on waters, on these areas of moss on this system, always wet. We measured methane. And what we found, very straightforwardly here, is just that there is a difference to prove this. Any point that you see here above this dotted line is where methane is being produced to save time on this system. So you can see, and look at the change, there are numbers changing here. Bigger numbers to smaller numbers, because we're moving across a landscape that is very heterogeneous. But we need to know something about, within reason, all of those repeating units on that landscape. And what we find is that, yes, in all these wetland areas, we produce some amount of methane, either lots, a little bit less on the edges. Then when we get round to the edges again, they're even drier, sometimes not taking up methane, sometimes giving methane. Same here. But when we come to the forest, when we have birch forest particularly, at the edges we saw, then this is now a small number, but it's taking up methane. So the net amount we see in the landscape is that. Now, we wanted to scale this because hotspots may produce lots of methane in very small areas, but they are surrounded by lots of forest. And even though this number is small, over the large different areas, we want to see how this compares from hotspots of small, restricted area to the larger. So we do this using the same technique. This is a flux system to measure methane in the more complex than the sea carbon dioxide, but methane in the system that we had out there for some time. Measuring without chambers, measuring in the air and doing the physics. But we've got to put this into a landscape context, and this is where much of this EO comes in and has been really, really important to us. So we were just using now, finding to go, what at these spatial scales that in which case we went up eventually to 10 by 10 kilometers, and that's tiny for Earth observation, I know, you'll laugh. But for us, it's a real big test from going from things that from meters to 10K. And just to get some idea, using Ikonos, our friends at the UCL in London, Matt Disney and his colleagues were working very hard with postdoctoral people there to produce these sort of images to see that we incorporate into this. So things like Landsat, LSOV2, which we've already seen from Gareth, but MODIS, yeah, way too big, not used to us. But we were able to use things like Ikonos. And the long story short, really, is that we were able to take information from satellite imagery, which we cropped then to the aerial photography that we had from the aircraft, reclassified that, and then laid over that, we've been able to have a go at where the flux footprint is at any point in time. Now, it moves, of course, with the wind direction, which is blowing around, so this is just one static, one moment. But remember, it's measuring at 10,000 times per second. So 24 hours a day, every day. But once we have this imagery where we can best classify the spatial distribution of the vegetation types that we find. Not perfect, mixed pixels, everything Gareth talked about, but as a first attempt to try to get some values at a spatial scale of the landscape from measurements that we have been taking over a few meters squared to a kilometer squared at most. And it's been very, very important for us to do this, to put our work, our ecological work, into that context. And this is just showing briefly some of the issues with aerial photography, Iconos, then adjusted for the full 10 by 10 kilometer area we've looked at, just to see how we do in terms of what percentage of land cover do we get from these images. There are some issues, but we didn't do too badly as a first go. Okay, the other thing that we have then is other information that's happening on a bigger scale. Maybe many of you here will have heard, if not know something about FluxNet, this very important network of these so-called flux towers that measure this gas exchange without chambers. Lots in America, a good number now in Russia, which is great. We're sort of addressing that sort of balance here, but not so many in this far north here as well at the moment, so I'm sure there are people trying to address that as I speak. But what they're trying to do is, again, the same issue on a much bigger scale to the globe now, is from those type of data they have from this network, how do they scale to regions and the globe? Well, again, it's not easy. But using remote sensing products to describe these site characteristics are important. So what metrics are required to capture the main factors, whether it's tundra forest, boreal forest, or, so often the case, this transition zone? Soil moisture, leaf area index that Gareth very clearly explained to us, vertical stand structure again, thank you Gareth, in LiDAR data. The question is, though, as Gareth made plain as well, are these data available for all sites in the times that we want them? No, is the answer, but getting much better. And the way that people like my friend Paul and others are addressing this issue is that saying scaling, ecology, and the carbon cycle synthesis are not going away. We have to address these big issues. And a sane way to do this is to look at this multi-scaling. But Earth observation and working with people who are key experts in Earth observation is critical to join with the process-based ecologists. But each of us has to, of course, meet at the edges of our comfort zone. But that's often where some of the very exciting challenges and advances are made. The other thing that Paul, when he was a postdoc with us, was very keen again was, again, how do we begin to address that issue of upscaling ecological information and downscaling remote sensing? We need to do that on model simulations to finer scales. They are still grand challenges. They're great challenges to have. They will still be here when I retire from my work. But they're very important challenges. We have to have good spatial extrapolation. But, as Gareth has shown also, when you look at these things like NDVI, many of the relationships that we're looking at do not scale linearly. And that also gives us lots of challenges for the future. So the sort of things that Paul has been trying to do is just to look at the aggregation of data at different spatial scales and see what we can pull out from that. And his paper is there, should you wish to, in landscape ecology, should you wish to chase that. Other things recently as well, plant phenology changes in response to climate change, a recent paper that's up and being debated at the present time. How do we get this snow-free vegetation index? Sergey mentioned often we see this whenever, in particularly northern regions, when we want to access imagery clearly at much of the seasons, of course snow is potentially present. And what do we do and how do we deal with that to look at the vegetation? And these folks and others, these people and others, are looking at satellite monitoring of plant phenology, as we've already said, NDVI, looking at novel-free, snow-free vegetation indices, things like normalized difference greenness index, they call this now, another variant on NDVI and those things, again using the same bands that Gareth kindly introduced. To see again if we can improve our predictive powers. One of the things they tried originally was, can they predict the growing start of the growing season and also the end of the season? So here is a system of NDGI, this greenness index. Here's measured gross primary productivity. And again, just seeing how we fit using the vegetation index when we have the beginning and the end of the season. Can we get that right as a start, at least? The fine detail in the middle, maybe not, but do we actually get that right? And so people are using these very important Earth observation products that Sergei and yourselves are producing. And we thank you very much for that. It's advanced this idea of climate change research phenomenally in recent decades. Just touching on other aspects with Kevin, who will speak soon. We have a joint project at the present time, which I'll say tomorrow. But again, now we're looking at things, again, Sergei very kindly touched on, which is very much wildfires so important for this country. We have a project with colleagues from the Sokachov Institute of Forest in Krasnoyarsk, Yelena Kukovskaya and colleagues, which we're just finishing at the moment, and I'll say more about that tomorrow. But again, the key thing is, here, using NDVI, using a product called the normalized burn ratio as well of pre and post fire, can we detect signals from space and interpret them, as Sergei has already said, in a manner that gives us confidence that we can see this? And what we're interested in as biologists in this system, with Yelena, a forest biologist, is, again, these trajectories of change that we burn, but what do we get back? Do we get back to forest, in this case, pine forest in southeast Siberia between Chita and Ulan-Ude? Or, Gareth's already mentioned that the northern edge of the forest moving north, by connection, the southern edge of the boreal forest potentially also moving north and contracting, sorry. Steplands are to the south. What trajectory are we getting of recruitment of vegetation? Are we going back to pine forest again over time? Dependent upon fire frequency, fire intensity and the time of year, all those wonderful things that Sergei has already shown us. What is the trajectory going to be? And can we do something from space that allows us, again, at the correct spatial scale, to do that? More of that tomorrow. But that's what we're doing, is using remote sensing, combining again with field data, constructing explanatory models of these potential abrupt ecological shifts, again, which Sergei mentioned. And what that means with colleagues such as Jörg Kaduk to Leicester University as well, in terms of modeling, in terms of what that means for the surface energy exchange we touched on earlier in this talk, carbon exchanges, and what we would term eco-hydrological, ecology and hydrological fluxes, gases, water in that system. And that's our framework, if you like. And to finish, I will also make an advert in the University of Durham, with some snow, just for context. We have something called the Durham Arctic now. It's funded by the Leverhulme Trust of the United Kingdom. And as part of that, in red, you will see that there are some summer schools. I'm leading those summer schools. I think we're coming to Russia, in fact, in Arkhangelsk, I think, in June of next year. But the following year, there will be another one which will be fully open to international early career researchers. I'll give you the website there. And should anybody be interested, when we look out for our adverts, we are welcoming in a whole host of people from around the world to join us in an early career researcher working on broadly topics related to the Arctic and northern Eurasian area. Many thanks go to a lot of people, not least Kevin and others in the audience. Thank you very much. Спасибо. Oh, I should have spoke slower. I should have spoken more slowly. No, it's fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. My question is about the slide of the vegetational map in the beginning of your report.
Ah,
yeah.
At the very beginning.
In the very beginning.
Oh,
yeah. Just
yeah. Oh, technology. This one on this front screen, or
no, just
which one? Sorry.
This one, yes, I think this
number.
Number.
Oh.
I don't see it.
Oh, sorry.
What is number?
I can't. This one.
Yes,
this one.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this the right picture is about the forecast. Yes, right.
Projected vegetation on the right, correct, yeah.
Yeah.
But this is back in 2004, okay.
Yeah, but my question is, why nothing happened in Greenland? Just, I see just, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question, which I didn't draw the map and can't answer, unfortunately. Yes, I don't know why, and it's an area I know little about myself, I'm afraid. Maybe, I don't know who else can do that, but certainly, yes. I mean, there's lots of work going on from my colleagues and others in Denmark, in Sweden, which are looking at those areas. But yeah, so why that didn't, and they were doing it long before 2000, so I don't know, is the direct answer. Because certainly there's a lot of, in fact, I've examined 2 PhD theses in the last few years, which have worked there and shown some very interesting data. They've been working there actually, again, trying to move away, partly answer your question in some ways, if I may, but partly, again, moving away from this problem that we have at the scale I work at, which is to use chambers. This idea to enclose and measure the gases. But of course, everything changes. Of air pressure, yeah, the gas comes from the soil maybe, or you stop it coming from the soil and the wind blows, and yeah. Similarly with warming, we use chambers sometimes to warm because we have no power, and we can do that. But again, we change the humidity and things. There they have been using free air temperature increases. They have been using infrared lamps for this warming, forcing the increased warming from more CO2 without chambers. And that's very interesting because you don't change the water, soil, well, you can change, but you don't artificially change the soil, water, and those things. And they are showing changes, for sure, so yeah. But for this side of things, in terms of the vegetation, really, again, it's slightly more high polar tundra in that sense. It's more sparse in terms of the landscape. Will it change? Yes, it will probably densify. But because you're dealing with already a very low occurrence on the landscape, those changes are sometimes more restricted than we would see much more in terms of the birch forest or the more coniferous forest, the spruce forest in Russia, or indeed the larch as we come to the Far East. So again, it's a matter, as Gareth has said, really of time as well over these periods about what will change when. And that might be, I'm not saying that is it, but that might be a reason why this process is. It's just simply the vegetation is relatively sparse, slow changing, adapted to growing very slowly in many cases. Whereas if you warm for some of the trees where there are the trees, then yeah. Does that, I hope that in some way tries to answer the question anyway. Yeah.
So, more questions? Why Iceland became forested? That is my question.
No. Yes, it's a very good question. I honestly don't know. No.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. So first I want to notice about FluxNet that there is a new recovery station in Khanty-Mansiysk. Maybe it's not inside the FluxNet, I don't know, but there is.
Oh, excellent.
And
This is good. This is
there
great.
were a paper by Timo Vesala and so on about it. And I have a question about Russia. So actually, is there a lack of data about Russia, or there is no? For example, current amount of data with the sophisticated models are enough for inventories, for predictions, and so on. And the second question, if there is a lack of data, which data are the most
Crucial, yes.
Crucial for current studies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good questions. I sometimes discuss with my colleagues this very question, because the logistics of going to those far northern parts of Russia is tricky, but events certainly such as these UK Russia bursaries and these sort of things, and that friends I know that go up there in terms of Lena Delta and various things. So I know of some. I don't know of everything, but just accessing those parts of the Arctic is more difficult. So there is that aspect to it, I think. I would suspect, just as in the forest systems that I've been working on, okay, now in the south, is that through our colleagues there, for example, in my naivety, there was lots of information that has not yet been formally published, but certainly within the Forest Service and the people that are working that system, has been crucial to the sorts of studies that we've been trying to do. So I think in terms of some formalized data, as everywhere else in the world, I think, I wouldn't say there's a lack, but that what we could do with more, certainly. But I think there's a lot of, not to say unpublished, but a lot of unformalized data which has been carefully collected by professional people, which could be drawn upon and could be used a lot and would help a lot, I think, in terms of ensuring that, because your question is very important, because filling gaps with models is a very interesting proposition. Sorry, I keep doing this. It's a very interesting proposition. How confident are we that we're correct? We do need some field data. And my argument has been that yes, we can't go everywhere in terms of process, but we could get a better spatial coverage in some crucial areas. Now, what those crucial things are, certainly we saw there in terms of things of soil moisture, soil depth, the amount of carbon that's in the system and such like. Yeah, we've got soil maps for these regions, sure, but how many points are they interpolating in terms of that? And I think in a large, you have a great country that covers a very big area circumpolarly, and again, it's what spatial scale, again, can we be confident that helps us to better predict? So it's not a real good answer, I'm afraid. I think it's a mixed situation and I think a lot of people are trying to address it, quite frankly, of trying to target where we might do better. There was a very interesting paper, which, in a biological sense, that came out, which caused a lot of interest, shall we say, where many of us, like myself, mentioned KVO, mentioned Abisko, mentioned research stations in Russia, for example, or wherever, and publications come from that. And then they did this meta-analysis, this analysis of the outcomes. And of course, the outcomes that you get are often very much what this guy was saying, is that they're often determined by the fact that you have studied in great detail one small aspect of the circumpolar Arctic. And there are these hotspots of information. And his argument was, well, how representative is that really? And I think the debate rages on. It's an interesting thing to follow and read, because some people think we're doing quite well, others think we're not doing very well at all. And so it's an interesting debate.